So a few days ago I made a video regarding a theory I saw on Reddit about the P-generation, and more specifically its ties to our current arc, the Inchon arc. The theory was made by a user named Sasuke, or Apprentice Sasuke, and his theory was divided into 3 parts, with my initial video covering solely his third part, as the first 2 parts were more related to Gu's Hwarang lineage than what I was talking about in my video. Well, in this video we're going to be covering the first 2 parts of that theory, and again I'm going to link the theory in the description for easy access, and because Sasuke deserves the credit for this. But without further ado, let's get into it. If you're new to this channel, first of all, welcome. I make videos on lookism. I'm a very simple guy. But if you're not new to this channel, you most likely know that I'm not only a huge fan of Gu Kim, but I've actually made a video regarding his backstory in the past. At the time, nobody had really taken Gu Kim that seriously as a character, especially considering all we really had regarding his backstory was a couple lines of dialogue. Now don't get me wrong, we still really only have a couple lines of dialogue, but as opposed to at that time, where all we really knew was that he was a prodigy with the Hwarang sword, capable of even slaying goblins on the run after cutting down his teacher. PTJ seems to now actually care a little more about Gu Kim as a character and is fully delving into his lineage, with the latest chapter even presenting us the big reveal of the Hwarang sword in all of its glory. At the time, we didn't know what the Hwarang sword was, whether or not it was actually a sword, like a physical blade, or just a name for the philosophy tied to Gu's lineage. Neither did we know what the term goblins was referring to, what the phrase cutting down actually meant contextually, or what the name Hwarang even meant for that matter. As of right now though, it's safe to say that we still don't know what any of these mean, but the only difference is we're getting extremely close to knowing what they mean by knowing everything they could mean, or at least everything that makes sense. I went over all of this in my video, which I urge you to check out, in regards to Gu Kim's Hwarang lineage, what goblins actually are, what the Hwarang sword might have been. But one thing I didn't exactly mention or theory craft about was Gu's connection to his master and his actual backstory. Not the Hwarangs, not the sword, not the mythological and historical nexus between Gu Kim and the Hwarangs. However, more so what might have actually taken place in Gu Kim's earlier days. And as we inched closer to the Inchon saga, interest in Gu Kim began to rise to how it was before the gun incident, and as a result, a user by the name of Sasuke on Reddit decided to make a theory on Gu Kim's backstory, and though I don't agree with the entirety of the theory, I do think it's as close as anyone's ever gotten to actually discovering what might have happened to this guy, before it gets revealed to us, that is. The theory kicks off addressing the concept of the Hwarang sword as a whole, and the way PTJ has been building this up ever since its initial appearance and mentioning. In Gun's backstory, chapter 527, as I mentioned earlier, we got to hear of Gu Kim's beginnings as well as the reason the Hwarang sword is even tied to our guy. He cut down his master, and to this day we still do not know whether or not cut down means kill, or if it just means injure, and we also do not know who his master was. As of chapter 557, a new mention of the Hwarang sword was made. Gu Kim, reminiscing over Gun and trying to beat his high score in a video game, receives a text from a contact whose caller ID Gu Kim had blocked, which is sinister in and of itself because it implies Gu Kim hadn't exactly got off on the right foot with this person, and said person just flat out says Hwarang sword is in Inchon. PTJ is trying to tell us that Gu Kim is connected to Inchon, nice, but how connected to Inchon exactly is he? In the same chapter, that being 557, Gun mentions that Inchon reminds him of Gu, implying that something must have happened with Gu and Inchon that Gu decided to share with Gun, because you don't just share something like that if you don't think it means much, do you? If Gu had just had a vacation to Inchon and he fucking robbed the bank or did whatever, it wouldn't be a memory that would resonate with the person you told it to, so much so that the place would remind you of them every time it was mentioned. At least I don't think it would. It would have to be something deeper than that in order for it to actually have a permanent connection to Gu. Fast forward to the actual Inchon arc. After learning about Yuja Seon, the second half asking of Inchon, on a phone call with Samuel, Gu actually mentions that him and Yuja know each other a little. I don't mean to read too deeply into everything here, but knowing Gu and his sarcastic tendencies, he probably knows him more than just a little, and the theory here takes a detour to a more historical setting, away from lookism but to do with the Hwarangs. This is something I believe I did mention in my video, that being the martial art the Hwarangs actually innovated. So the Hwarangs, more formally known as the Hwarang Do, actually had their own martial art, and this martial art was primarily a combination of 3 separate styles. At the time of making my video, we didn't exactly know who Yuja Seon was or really anything about the Inchon backstory, so even if I had gone over their martial art, it would have been impossible for me to make a connection from this to the actual story, and that's where Sasuke comes in and is pretty much the primary reason I actually enjoyed his theory so much. In my video though, I mentioned that the 3 fighting styles the Hwarang Do encompasses were Subak, swordsmanship, and Caecilium. As for Sasuke though, he makes a distinction here which I think could end up being more accurate, as he seems to have done more extensive research on this, but instead of Caecilium, Hapkido seems to have been the 3rd martial art that completed Hwarang Do, and as opposed to Subak, he mentions a martial art by the name of Teisu Do. One thing my video and his theory did have in common though was one of the fighting styles' eventual development into Taekyon. The theory goes as follows. Hwarang Do is a combat style that includes Kumdo, Hapkido, and Teisu-do. These 3 incorporated together become Hwarang Do. Now some of you may know this, though it isn't exactly common knowledge, but South Korea's history at one point included an era by the name of the 3 Kingdoms era, and Hwarang Do is a martial art whose genesis was in this era. It was founded by 2 brothers, and at a later point in time, a 3rd master was authorized to incorporate Hapkido into it. Now, this leaves us with the conclusion that the most complete version of Hwarang, though, as opposed to being founded by 2 people, was created via the cooperation of 3 primary figures. Now, let's delve a bit deeper into what these martial arts actually are. Kumdo is basically the Korean version of Kendo, if you're familiar with that is. It is a martial art primarily revolving around swordsmanship, and in chapter 344, Gukim is implied to be a prodigy in this martial art. Kumdo, as opposed to Kendo, is a far more idealistic martial art, focuses much less on striking in contrast to the fighter's mentality. This is seen in chapter 473 in Gukim's battle with Hangul Bake, as Gu says, a sword. It's all in how you perceive it, which means anything can become a sword. Even a broken piece of wood can become a sword, depending on your mindset. That's right, from the moment I thought of this as a sword, it became one. He says this while slicing off Hangul's limbs with a panel that shows us Gukim in his young age, staring at someone who may have been his master that we don't know yet, as we don't exactly see his face fully and neither do we get any confirmation regarding that. This begs the question though, since Hwarang-do combines these 3 martial arts, one of them being Kumdo, what exactly does Hwarang-do do differently to Kumdo? Well, Hwarang-do as a martial art transforms Kumdo entirely and has a vast array of named techniques which one can train that revolve around the way of the sword. I will not be going over these techniques though because one of my friends is planning on making a video on them soon. Back to Sasuke's theory now, where he mentions one of the techniques Hwarang-do adapts, that being Sang-kum or dual/twin sword techniques. This is shown to be utilized by Gu in chapter 514, and this is also where this theory transforms from just a theory regarding Gu's backstory into a theory about Yuji and Jaegyeon's backstory as well, because it seems to be the case that they are partly connected through Incheon. As we know and as it has been stated in the series in chapter 545 and 564 respectively, Yuji and Jaegyeon are fighters that embody 2 opposing angles of a martial art, that being Taekyon. However, it isn't exactly only Taekyon that these 2 fighters are using. Back to a martial art that I mentioned earlier in this video, that being Hapkido. Hapkido is a martial art that I mentioned in one of my previous videos, which was actually a chapter review, and it was the chapter before Jaegyeon's kicks were revealed to be Taekyon if I recall correctly, and I was pretty much suspecting that Jaegyeon's primary martial art would be Hapkido. Hapkido is one of the 3 primary martial arts of Hwarang-do, and it combines striking, the principle of that being kicks, as well as grappling in the form of wrist locks and other techniques to formulate a complete style of combat. What differentiates Hapkido from Taekyon though? Taekyon has a new style which is catered to sports and basically olympifies the martial art, if that's even a word, and in this style, grappling is fundamentally banned. The reason this is important though is because Yuji and Jaegyeon have been shown in the past to employ martial arts techniques which don't exactly fit the style of Taekyon. They lean more towards Hapkido. An example of this being this sort of wrist lock takedown Jaegyeon performs on Daniel, which effectively renders him useless. We also see Yuji do this to Jake Kim, which I don't even want to think up a name for because he pretty much just toys him around like a child. If you're still not convinced though, this move that Yuji performs on Daniel is not present in Taekyon. However, it does exist in Hwarang-do. You also get this grab and redirection from Hwarang-do, as well as a wide selection of other moves that you can see for yourself in the theory as Sasuke presents it. Now, in the final section of the first part of Sasuke's theory, he makes a connection to colors, which at first may sound irrelevant, but in my opinion is a pretty clever sort of revelation to come to, especially because it would not be beyond PTJ to write something like this into his story. As you all may know, Jaegyeon and Yuji are centered around 2 colors, red and blue. These 2 colors are also like the big 2 in real life. It's always red versus blue this, red versus blue that, and that is pretty much what the narrative paints with Jaegyeon and Yuji here. We've seen multiple of their face-offs, even the one when they were younger, where Jaegyeon had the red outfit and red hair and Yuji had the blue outfit and blue hair. Not to mention Jaegyeon's red top was also worn by Gu Kim at one point, but we won't get into that though, as it could just be PTJ recycling outfits, though it would be pretty convenient that the man who steals outfits from Gun would steal an outfit from someone else he's connected to, Jaegyeon. Anyway, back to the color connection. Jaegyeon is red and Yuji is blue, fantastic. Now this makes up for 2 of the 3 primary colors on the color wheel. There is a 3rd color that's missing though. 3 martial arts, but we only have Hapkido and Teisudo, no swordsman. 3 colors, but we only have red and blue, no yellow. Wait a minute. Could it just be that Gu Kim was their 3rd all along? Yuji could be the hands of Hwarang, Jaegyeon could be the feet, but who would actually be the sword? Who would be the man fit to actually take the Hwarang sword from Peichon? None other than Gu Kim. Now Sasuke ends off the initial part of his theory mentioning that the cutting down part was sort of a mistranslation from Webtoon, and that the more accurate translation of what the text would be is stabbed, which leaves us unsure of whether or not he actually killed his master, but this makes it a lot more likely for Gu's master to actually be someone from Incheon, someone who may have had a sad ending that could have drawn Gu away from Incheon and the whole entire Hwarang philosophy all along. As all of you may know, Gu isn't exactly a fan of the Hwarang philosophy, and only when he's serious does he actually even mention it, let alone adapt it. He hates anyone even mentioning the Hwarang at all, and that was one of the principles he had for Charles Choi in order to actually work for him. So what might have been the catalyst for drawing Gu away from Incheon and the Hwarang so much? Moving on to part 2 of the theory regarding Peichon and Yugang, Sasuke actually makes a pretty clever connection here between Yugang and the theory of Jaegyeon, Yuji, and Gu, saying that a combination of the colors red, blue, and yellow would give us a tinge of brown, which seems to have been the color Yugang embodied. Now the second part of the theory is more revolving around Yugang's death. How did Yugang die? It is initially outright stated to us that Yujie was the one who killed the former king of Incheon, that being Yugang of course, the man whose title was true king of Incheon. However, as you all may know, statements this direct aren't always 100% accurate with PTJ. He's been one to say one character has killed another in the past, and later on it gets revealed to us that it wasn't just that character, it was multiple people at once. Hwarang, for example, was stated to have been killed by Kite, however that wasn't exactly the case, as James and Kite had killed them together. As for James and Kite though, it appears to have been mutually intentional, and it also could have not been. Kite has always been one to divert from what a plan initially says, and that was the whole reason James had to call the cops on bro. And I mentioned in my previous video on this theory, part 3 of this theory, that Yugang and Peichon pretty much embodied the Hwarang and Shingan of the Incheon saga. Their stories shared their similarities, but they also had their differences. But one thing that would be true if this theory turns out to be what happens is that Yugang and Hwarang not only fulfilled the same role, but also went out in the same way. Now back to the theory. It is mentioned by Tom Lee that Gookim messes around no matter what weapon he has, he doesn't have a single serious bone in his body, and in most cases this is true except for when Goo has a sword or anything he perceives as a sword. Certain examples of this can be the cold switch in demeanor in the Tom Lee fight, or in the UI Daniel fight, the Hangul Bake fight even, so on and so forth. The moment he drops the weapon though, he appears to immediately switch back to his normal self, and in the Hangul Bake fight, he even goes so far as to say that the philosophy is cringe, and he sounds cringe saying it. Now, the theory ends with a pure headcanon part that is most likely not gonna go down as Sasuke narrates it, because quite frankly, what the fuck would the odds of that be? So I'm not gonna go over it entirely because I urge you guys to go read the theory in all of its parts for yourselves. However, one thing that kinda does stand out as odd to me is having Yugang be Goo's master when Goo's master was implied to be an old man both appearance and statement wise, and I'm not sure if Yugang ever would have made it to that age, but regardless, this is a sick theory and I'm glad to finally see someone delve even deeper into Goo's backstory than ever before. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments. For now though, I'm out.